Hey everyone, welcome back to Scholar Origins, the podcast that brings you all the evidence, history, fun facts about any concept that we use in learning and development, instructional design, and all the other practices that enable people to do their jobs better. Today we have an amazing episode. I mean, I have to say that it's an amazing episode because we have a guest. So every time I have a guest, is an amazing episode. And this guest is a great guest. His name is Matthew Schmidt. Actually, going to say is Dr. Schmidt, and he is a professor at UF, University of Florida. Go Gators! So I'm going to welcome Matthew. We're going to talk about learning experience design. That's right, the topic you love, LXD. Welcome, Matthew. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me today, Alex.
So glad that you're here. I'm really happy that you have agreed to do this. Actually, for folks that don't know, we landed in this conversation in a way out of a post that I made over on LinkedIn. It got over, I don't know, 20, it's probably now at 30,000 impressions and a bunch of reactions, obviously, because this topic is super popular, super controversial. Many people sit in different areas and different environments and different angles of what learning experience design is. So we're here to talk to someone that is carrying the flag on that in terms of the academic sides and other areas, and we're going to learn more about it. But Matt, let's go ahead and allow you to let us know who you are, what you do, what you care about in these days, and go ahead and give us that.
Sure. My name is Matthew Schmidt. I am a professor at the University of Florida, where I do research and I teach courses. I'm currently teaching a course on learning experience design, and a lot of my research lately has been about learning experience design. It's not exactly something that I planned to do. It's something that I more fell into. I have been working in doing human-centered design, I would say, since like 2003. And incorporating that into my own design practice, particularly working with individuals with disabilities and creating engaging learning experiences for them, has led me into this area that has now become known as learning experience design. So that's kind of where I spend my time and how I ended up here.
No, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for that. And folks, if you want to check the show notes here when we're in Spotify or any other platform, make sure that you check. There will be links there so you can get in touch with Matt and his programs or what he's interested about, and also links and to the sources as always of anything that I will bring up here that we talk about and we do things. This is a conversation. We're not going to get into big debates, more of a friendly conversation. I want to learn more about Matthew's perspective on LXD so I can then also inform myself and help you make better decisions when you're thinking LXD versus ISD versus ID. That's always been a conversation. So let's get into it, Matt. Let's talk about it. LXD, learning experience design. I think the most helpful thing that we can probably establish up front to have a clear conversation is the context, right?
Mhm.
Because they are, we're living in the age, we're living in the era of social media. Communication is quite distorted. There's quite a bit of good information, but there's also a lot of misinformation, and that goes pretty much for everything, right? So when you say LXD, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's actually a bigger question than it might seem. Because if you would have asked me that question, let's say 5 years ago, I probably would have had a much different answer than I do now. I think in order to kind of provide that context, we have to go back in time a little bit and take a look at what was happening around 2018, which is when we really started to see this term gaining prominence and people using it widely and people adopting it as a job title. And then, I would say that it's kind of exploded on the job scene since. You take a look at Indeed or LinkedIn, you're going to find hundreds of job posts that are looking for people with skills related to learning experience design. People 5 years ago and even today, when you go to them and you say, "What do you think learning experience design is?" People working in our field in the uh, training and learning industry, they're going to be familiar with the term and they're probably going to give you an answer. But I bet if you went and asked 10 people, they'd probably give you 10 different answers. So
Mm.
one of the first things that we realized, and by we I'm referring to a group of colleagues that I work with: Yvonne Earnshaw, Isa Yanka, Noah Glazer, Andrew Toffick, and others, where we've really kind of tried to investigate this issue with a bit more depth. The first thing that we realized is that we really need to do a better job defining what this is. And that was not an easy nut to crack because there just wasn't a lot out there that we could refer to. So the first place that we started was we had edited a book where we'd invited a number of authors to write a chapter in this book about their own learning experience design practice. This is a freely available book. It's released under a Creative Commons license, so anyone can download it. And I'm happy to give you the link to that, Alex. Now, the way that the method that we used to define this was we actually went through all of the book chapters that were included in that book, and we looked at how people were defining LXD, how they were characterizing it, what theories they were using, what methods they were using, and really tried to take this holistic view of what it is and kind of squish it all together to come up with a succinct answer of what it is, and not just based on our opinions of what it is, but based on what people who are actually doing LXD in their actual design practice, how they're characterizing it. And as a result of that, we came away from it with an understanding that it's theoretically informed, that it applies methods from user experience design, that it draws from external influences such as HCI and human centered computing, and that these all kind of coalesce within the field of learning design to create a human-centered approach to learning experience design that is deeply informed by UX methods. That's kind of how I would define it, but that's quite an academic definition. So if I can maybe take it and put it into more practical terms, I think what I would say is what we have here is a logical evolution of instructional design that bridges instructional design with user experience design. And there's a lot of nuance that goes into that that might be lost in translation. But if I can just make the kind of the most simple soundbite version of a definition, I think that's what I would call it.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's quite a good explanation there. I think listening to what you mentioned and a few things you said, um, we can maybe attempt somewhat of a quick synthesis here and say that is the transdisciplinary and almost transformational practice of instructional design as it is known or as it was known. There are some some interesting aspects there to kind of hit on, especially that you. It's I love it that you mentioned 2018 because I published an article. My quest on this, so a lot of people know me for doing research in different places or just bringing concepts up. That's what this podcast is all about. First, but it's not my first time doing this. So when I was president of the local ATD chapter, I ran a few series of interviews called Off the Cuff, and that was more of a sort of a uncensored, sort of like a Piers Morgan type of thing, with the concepts and kind of bringing people and asking questions. And
Yeah.
in that, I ran an episode with a gentleman from Netherlands. I don't know if you're aware of him, Niels Floor, by chance.
Yeah. Niels and I have had some really great conversations. I
Oh,
actually just got his book yesterday. I know he released it a few weeks ago. It finally arrived on my doorstep yesterday. I'm excited to dig into that.
yeah. Initially, when I had conversations, so again, folks, for everybody listening, links on the descriptions, and also remember that we have a monthly newsletter on LinkedIn, where you're going to see kind of like a breakdown of our discussion here with Matt, and also the link obviously to the podcast episode if you're on LinkedIn and you're the LinkedIn person many people see or are aware of the podcast based on my LinkedIn post. So yeah. So yeah, so the conversations that I had in the beginning, I kind of dug into that because the reason why I looked into LXD to begin with was because exactly what you were mentioning. Tons of emphasis, tons of inspiration and enthusiasm for a lot of people in L&D. Now, in learning and development, as you may know or not, because obviously you're in the academic side of things, you may not be so involved with the commercial industry thing. They have, we have and I mean, it happens everywhere. It happens in research, which is the bandwagon effect, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you know about that. So it happened with the IPISD, for example, when Addy was sort of created out of nowhere, and then all the other models behind it kind of dag at it, and then it's kind of died, and they diluted, and then the commercial, So back to LXD, we have a lot of people talking about LXD, and some influential people were bringing this up, right? So, oh yeah, LXD, it's better, it's the best, the way to go. So there's sort of a marketing flair there. There's some
Mhm.
accreditation that people say, oh yeah, this is a nice label just for instructional design. Now I know, based on your definition, obviously, that we're looking at other things, integrating other things like UX and integrating, human-centered design and perhaps design thinking as well. Um,
Certainly.
do you in and I wrote an article, the whole winded thing that I said was because I wrote the article on November 20th, which started the conversation in 2018. So 2018, this article is on LinkedIn, and I mentioned Niels. And then I did an interview with Niels. At the time when I talked to Niels has a background in interaction design. And his inspiration, as I recall, was basically saying, he got a little frustrated with the things you were seeing in academia, which, and many times it's lecture based and, not really care. It's more of a standard. If I would say the difference between pedagogy and andragogy, right? Which is pedagogy is like, hey, here's a standard. You need to do this and you need to get past this so you get the grade, right?
Mm.
In summation, but obviously that's another debate. So my question to you is, okay, we're combining HCD, we're combining design thinking, we're combining UX. What aspects, if any, then are you maintaining or keeping from instructional systems design?
Yeah. So that's another one of those questions that on the surface seems pretty easy, but then when you kind of start to scratch, you realize there's like layers of an onion beneath it. Um, so let me just start by saying some of the research that we've done, and then maybe we can go a little bit deeper. Um, to answer that question, we've done two things. The first thing that we've done is we've done a job posting analysis. So what does that mean? We've gone onto LinkedIn, we've gone onto Indeed, we scraped them for 4 months straight, looking for all of the job postings related to LXD. Uh, and then we went through all of those job postings and we pulled out all of the knowledge, skills, and abilities statements that were included in them. And we categorized them based on a pre existing coding scheme that we already have that's been used to classify instructional design competencies. And then what we were able to do is we were able to see there are clearly overlaps with competencies that are related to instructional design. But when we take those off the table, there's this pile of competencies that remains that don't fit into those existing categories. And so these are things that we can see are different from what we've traditionally characterized as instructional design. Many of these have to do with, as you've already noted, design thinking, also with aesthetics, as well as with understanding of UX principles, and a particular focus on usability research and user research as applied in the learning design space. So that's one piece of research that we've done. The other piece of research that we've done is because our definition came essentially from a qualitative analysis, which is not necessarily the most objective approach. We decided to take our findings from that, kind of break them down into a survey form almost, and send that out to experts in the field in a Delphi study in order to see where we could find consensus from practitioners, experts, and others who are working in the L&D industry around some of the definitions and concepts and methods that we believe are associated with learning experience design. And again, what we're finding there is some of the things that we thought might apply to learning experience design, experts didn't necessarily see that those were valuable in terms of our understanding of it. Whereas other things that we identified, there's some strong consensus around, people saying, yeah, I think that that's absolutely part of what we need to understand there. So in terms of how it differs and how it's the same and so on, I think it's really important that we're able to look at what's different and what is the same. But at the same time, I get concerned when people kind of want to pit them against one another, like it's a horse race. Like instructional design's better or learning experience design's better, because I would never hear that kind of a conversation about, interface design is better or interaction design is better, because we're looking at things that we can use to do. These are tools that we can use to do different things depending on what our design context is. So I'm never going to be the kind of person who says, instructional design's dead, we need to do LXD. Instead, I'm going to be the kind of person who says, I'm not going to use a screwdriver to, tighten a bolt. Instead, I'm going to use that to tighten a screw. I'm going to use a wrench to tighten a bolt. Same applies here. So if I've got a really kind of well-defined context with well-defined learners and well-defined learning objectives, let's say I've got a tight timeline, um, or let's say that I don't have learning objectives that are particularly higher order or complex, then I'd absolutely adopted an instructional design approach because it's so systematic, it's so efficient, that I would be able to create very effective instruction within that frame. But if I've got something that is maybe less well designed or maybe less well defined, where I don't necessarily have all the parameters, and maybe where there's some creativity that's going to be involved, or maybe where I'm using tech where we don't have the same level of knowledge. Like we've got the learning management system cracked. We know how to work in a LMS, but if we're talking about like designing XR experiences or creating like gamified mobile learning and things of that nature, where more exploration and creativity is required, in those kinds of situations, I'm probably going to lean more towards learning experience design and adopt a less rigid approach than like ADDIE, for example. I might use something like the successive approximation model in order to allow for that iteration and slowly developing an idea over time. So I would say that at the end of the day, we're still operating within the L&D sphere. It's just that we're using different approaches to achieve different outcomes with different methods, if that makes sense.
Good. And I know as you mentioned the Sam, I'm assuming you're alluding to Michael Allen's.
That's correct. That's correct.
That's only because I at somewhere I caught. I don't know if I caught it somewhere. I caught that Michael Allen was a big fan of oh my god, name escaping me now. Why am I Skinner? Why would I forget that? So anyway, yeah, he was a big fan of Skinner, and Skinner, obviously introduced successful approximation in terms of behavioral shaping, right? So
absolutely,
that can be confused sometimes, but only if your nerds know that, like me. So. All right. So yeah, that's a great point that you mentioned there. I think so. In that perspective, you mentioned some interesting things, and I think something that will be really rich, at least for me, is bringing me a new view into it, because obviously, everybody can be guilty of being a purist in many respects, especially when it comes to industry, right? So many of the things that are followed in learning and development they're not coming from empirical research. And they're not coming from really any research at all. Sometimes they're just coming from ideas. Sam is not a research model. After the fact, has been sort of some educators have researched it and did some peer review and stuff like that. But in the beginning, starts from an actual book before the Sam book in 2006 that Michael Allen wrote about learning development. So the LXD is an interesting one, though, because then you have this angle from Niels. He just published a book. correct. And as the one weakness that he had um, in the beginning, and I think he has sort of adjusted this after having conversation. I don't know, and I want to take credit that it's me that I gave him the the angle, but I did bring the questions to him because in our interviews, and everybody can go watch the interviews. I put two. Actually, I interviewed him maybe twice, and the links are in the show notes, as I say. The weakest that the weak link that he had in there was addressing enterprise learning, so enterprise training design, because learning experience design, as he was portrayed, is really based on the user experience. In other words, the learner is learner center. So we're saying all the things that sell, that sell really well, right? I mean, you can't dispute anything against human centered design. It is magical. It is genius. Whoever came up with the phrase. How can you're not. If I call it animal centered design, then it wouldn't be as right. So so you have a lot of people that in the learning and development sphere, you're going to hear this stuff, which is somebody creates something and then they push something else down to make their stuff look shinier or look better.
Mhm.
So that's the same happened with LXD, right? So that's why you get the whole against each other, because someone that has a good following will say, LXD is so much more evolved than instructional design. And so now the people practicing instructional design for over years, obviously they're going to have a reaction. What are you talking about? I've been doing
Mhm.
this for 20 some years. I was there when Robert Branson talked to Gagne and they came out with. Anyway, I wish I was there. So, so there's also an element of this, right? I mean, we have to be cognizant of that. There's an
Mhm.
element of popularity and stuff. As you mentioned, you have gone and researched job posts, right? I just ran a job post on Indeed, and when I plug in learning experience designer, everything that comes out is instructional design. There's maybe a few posts out there that now have adopted the title. We do see some employers that are adopting the title, but when you look at the job description, though, the bulk of it is the same thing that you will see for an instructional designer. So that mist, that fog is going to be there. I think the way you
Yeah.
blend in, where is including all this other things, is helpful. So my question is LXD a separate practice from instructional design or a subset of the practice of instruction?
Mhm. Um, I think that LXD in some ways it's about how it emerged. So um, instructional design, we have a rich tradition of both research and practice. We've got decades of evidence that supports what is effective and what works. And with learning experience design, this isn't something that came out of academia. This is something that grew in industry. And it was only when academia became aware of it that it began to become more formalized, right? And the things that were happening prior to then were in many ways like what you were intoning before. People kind of putting their best guesses out, centered around their professional judgment and their background, but not necessarily evidence based. So the way that I characterize that is, in research, we often have this research to practice gap where things that we're building, whether it's theory or method or actual products that are being built at universities, it takes a long time for that to permeate into industry. But the suggestion there is that knowledge only flows in one direction. It only goes from, academia out into the real world. But that's not the case at all. What we have with LXD is the opposite. We've got a practice to research gap. So what has happened is a phenomenon has emerged in practice, and now it's permeating the academy. It's coming into, the university setting, and now we're trying to, confront that and understand what that means. So that's actually really interesting because it means that this is something, in my view, that has already been acknowledged by industry as useful and important and so on.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where it's coming from. So there's a bit of a different piece, there's a bit of a different approach that's happening there. And if you look at the work that Niels Bohr has done, and you look at how he has approached this, it's a perfect example of what's going on here. So he has a background that is outside of instructional design, but he still has a very strong grasp of design, as a discipline writ large. Just like any good instructional designer worth their salt is going to have a very strong sense of design judgment and design expertise, right? Which is why designers tend to be multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary in the methods that they adopt and what they're building and so on. But to kind of bring this back to your question, are these separate? Are they the same? How do they differ? Um, I would say that
Just,
both center.
yeah, just to clarify, because
Yeah.
you mentioned something. I think the way you phrase it yours right now is a different angle. My main question is like, which one belongs to what, or are they,
Ah,
you know what I mean?
yeah.
Is
Yeah.
LXD a subset of instructional design, or is instructional design a subset of LXD?
Mm,
Interesting enough, Niels has published, or let's say posted things about this, where instructional design is actually a subset of.
mhm.
So, what's your angle on that?
I think there's a few arguments that have been put forward here, and I'll share what my take is on it. But there's the angle that LXD and ID are separate. There's the angle that instructional design is a subset of LXD. There's the angle that LXD is essentially UX principles that are permeating instructional design. And then there's kind of what's more of an eclectic angle, which says these are both valuable perspectives on design, and they probably sit alongside one another as siblings. My take is the more eclectic view. I tend to come at this from the perspective of using the right tool for the job. And so I see instructional design and learning experience design sitting alongside one another as complementary approaches to learning design, and not necessarily as one being superordinate or subordinate to the other.
Mm, okay. Yeah. So this is one of the things that I haven't agreed with him on that, only because of. I mean, I do believe in transdisciplinary approaches. I believe in, obviously, it's an enrichment, obviously, because everybody lives in their pocket. Everybody does research based on their expertise, right? And so, in that perspective, yeah, I like the ideas. So I like the idea, like I said, the angle that you're bringing in, which is, you know, um, which is really appropriate and smart in a sense, is that it's not a canvas, it's not a standard that you apply to everything. That perhaps when you want to do things that are technologies that evolve after, let's say, 1978, when we had the fruition of systemic approaches. Obviously, systemic approaches started back in the 40s or 60s. If we look at Rand Corporation, Humro, many different things. And obviously, Tyler's curriculum development is a systemic approach to education evaluation. Um, Going back since we're here and Dollar Origins, there are some interesting books that people could check out because there's always been the there has always been the concern about the experience of the learner, and that's
Mm.
another, let's say, angle sort of encompassing of learning experience design, or what like learning experience design sort of professes, right? So we have a book of Riverside Educational Monographs from 1908 or something like that, or
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
going back there, Changing
Yeah.
Conceptions of Education by Elwood Carverley,
Mm.
where he really walks or talks about professing in the education, the experience of the educator. You say, yeah, and you know where I'm going with this. Tell me, what are you thinking?
I mean, John Dewey was talking about this stuff back in 1908 and
Exactly.
learning experiences and really foregrounding the importance of experience to learners being able to master concepts and so on, being able to relate what they're engaging with their own prior knowledge, which in many ways was the foundation of the constructivist revolution.
Yes, yes. And so, Yes, and so we have Dewey, we have Coverly, we have Thorndike, and Thorndike provided us with this three different laws, right? Which I'm surprised today. I talked to many instructional designers, and I'm like, what? What are you talking about? So three different laws, which as far as I know, they have not been sort of disputed. Nobody has come around and go, law, that's not a law, because in science, a law is a strong statement, right? It's like,
Yes, indeed.
yeah. So, but the law of effect, the law of exercise, if you don't use it, you lose it, so to
That's
speak.
right.
The law of effect, which is, based on your experience. So we need to tie this into LXD because if you have a bad experience, you will not tend to engage as well. And if you have a good experience or let's say a rewarding experience in your learning experience, then you will tend to engage more. And obviously there's a good transition of things going from there. The interesting thing here, though, and since we're focused on workplace learning, is that systemic instructional design came in for a purpose. And the
Mm.
purpose is that basic instructional design sort of failed in World War II, right? Meaning that it wasn't as fast. It couldn't meet the speed of what we needed to do to defeat, to win the war. So there's a story about that, and actually, I think is Reiser, Professor Reiser out of
That's right.
yeah,
Robert Reeser, yeah.
he wrote a couple of articles on the history of instructional design, and then I dug a little deeper on this one, and then I found the book, which is the first episode of this podcast, the man, the instructor, and the job, which is
Mm.
fascinating. I don't know if you ever caught wind of that. It's not obviously, sadly, is not a academic, research, or let's say peer. It's more like a practical guide, which really sets all the basis of training and development. How to set up the training, where should the training happen. It should be as closest to the job as possible, part of production,
Mm.
and other angles there. Train to be actionable, not to have cold storage. Meaning don't tell me stuff now that I'm never going to use, and then 3 months, 6 months later, I have to remember what you told me 6 months ago or you taught me 6 months ago. So yeah, it's so super interesting, man. This conversation is it's such a rewarding experience in terms of kind of diving into all this stuff. So obviously that's the background, folks, that you can check off. You can check it out in terms of the background where these thoughts can come from, and the concern of a learning experience has always been there, but
Mhm.
the way the LXD brings it now obviously is more appealing to the populace, right? To the current folks that perhaps don't have this background of what instructional design has done in the last 40 years. So the question here, Matt, is if as you mentioned, if the main thing is how does LXD, one of the things that I see here, though, that since we're talking UX, because UX is really primarily focused on product creation. You know what I mean? So it's an experience, right? And you can look at it different ways, which is an interesting thing. I had an interview with Don Norman. You probably
Oh, cool. Yeah.
that is right. So with Don Norman, we talked about um, education and user experience and design thinking, and how has I asked him this one question, which was how has design thinking changed the educational sphere? And he said like it hasn't. It was a beautiful answer, but anyway, he talked to me about that, and I thought it was amazing. Are you aware of his group, the Niels?
Absolutely, yeah.
Is a Norman group, right? So they treat UX in different ways, obviously, and they had some legendary designers involved in there, and as Nielsen, for example, right? So in one thing that I noticed about them is that they started their certification programs with UX in mind, and
Mhm.
UX is the just for the folks listening. UX is not just designing an interface. UX also involves doing research, user research. But once again, it seems when we look at the commercial field, when we look at the job industry, UX is used mostly for product design.
Mhm.
So how does that permeate, or let's say, how does that transfer for the creation of educational programs, which are, you wouldn't say they're products, but more of a experience, right? Or let's say, you know, it, it's hard to explain, but I'll put it this way. If I'm doing something in Storyland, the UX is already built. The UI is already built. So I'm not changing anything there on the UI. Mean, unless I'm not using the player, unless I'm not using any other features, if I decide a whole custom thing, then I'll use UX or UI design. But the research will still be done in terms of the users and everything else. But why would I use that against ADDIE? Because ADDIE addresses the user, especially in the enterprise environment, because it's asking you to analyze the job, right? So what the user has to do and the tasks involved. What do you think?
Well, to the question about products, I think that that's really kind of more of a semantic question because when I work with teachers, all the teachers I know design products every day. They're creating worksheets, they're creating syllabi, they're creating class planning in order to deliver instruction and so on. Um, and those can absolutely be considered educational or learning oriented products, right? Maybe not in the traditional sense of a profit generating product like an app or a service, but nonetheless, these are products that are consumed by a very specific class of user, which is a learner. And that then kind of brings me to the second point, which is when we talk about user research, we're talking about any user using any technology or service for any purpose. But when we move that to a learner, it's a different playing field here because we're talking about a specific class of user, which is a learner, engaged in a specific task, which is a task that is related to learning, and not using any product or service, but using a very specific product or service. And that's one that is typically a learning technology. Now, I'm not saying that all learning experience design has to be focused on technology, but to be honest, almost all of it is. So we might as well just kind of cut to the chase. Now, in terms of ADDIE being able to address issues of learners using technologies in order to achieve goals, there's no question that that happens and that that can be very successful and effective. But in terms of creating experiences written broadly, not only focusing on cognitive outcomes, but also looking at the affective state of the learner, their emotional state, and their motivation, and designing experiences that are going to motivate them, that are going to be enjoyable, that are going to really jazz them up about what it is that they're learning. Um, that is a domain that, while learning designers understand that those are important, those are things that have not traditionally been a focus of the traditional ADDIE approach, right? So when I think about um, how we can use something like LXD within kind of an enterprise learning context, it's not just about creating an effective uh, content delivery approach, but instead it's kind of taking a very holistic view of the learner within an ecosystem of technology interaction while engaging in a learning task, and considering all aspects of the learner's experience while they're engaged in that learning task that's mediated by the technology. And that's a bit of a twist on the way that we commonly, from an instructional design perspective, are going to think about how a learner reaches a particular learning goal. Things that are completely disassociated with a cognitive outcome, or at least things that we don't traditionally put focus on, we may look at those a little bit differently when we're coming at it from this learning experience design angle. If that helps to shed a little light on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that makes some sense. So, I mean, we can. Do you feel which one do you feel will be stronger in terms of needs analysis? Would it be a classic approach with ADDIE, or would it be any type of sort of base LXD approach?
Well, that's a great question because when we talk about that front end analysis phase, looking at it from a learning experience design angle can include traditional approaches to needs analysis, context analysis, learner analysis, and so on. But we also have other tools that we can look at, such as empathy methods or ethnographic methods, and thinking more about groups of learners. One of the things where I would argue that Addie has not done a particularly good job is being able to create learning experiences for very diverse groups of learners. It tends to take a one size fits all approach. And I'm going to say that I'm painting in very broad brushes, and that's not always the case. But with a learning experience design approach, because the design process starts at the learner and really focuses in on understanding the learner at a much more fundamental level than what we see in the traditional methods that we use within, canonical instructional design. What we end up having there, um, we can still have the outcomes of analysis that we're going to get with traditional instructional design, uh, understanding what the gaps in knowledge are and things of that nature. But we're also going to understand things like what are some sociocultural issues that may play into the design of this instruction that we need to be very sensitive to. I'm reminded in particular of a design of AIDS awareness course that was for a Indian, the country, for an Indian context. And of course, many issues regarding sex and of course, AIDS are very taboo. And so thinking about those sociocultural issues and how to develop effective instruction within that kind of a context is a bit of a tricky business.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can see that. That's Yeah, thank you for that insight. That's awesome. Well, folks, listen, we can. I'm pretty sure. I feel that Matt and I here can be talking for another 8 hours about this stuff. It's quite deep. It's quite interesting. It's quite motivating, and yeah, it's fascinating, really. But for anybody else, just make sure you understand something too. Some key information here before we let Matt go is that he is. Tell me what your role is, but is the International Board of Standards for Training, Performance, and Instruction. It's be, and I've been aware of this for a while, which is we always say in the industry, oh, instructional design has no standards, but everybody goes. I say, well, there is this, but doesn't mean that everybody's going to follow it. So please let us know about that.
Yeah, so I am a board member at large, or a director at large, I think is my official title, for IBSTIPI. And in that role, I serve with a range of other directors to guide the development of standards and competencies for our field. Currently, we have a change of guard in the organization where many of the members who were involved in development of the 2012 set of standards have now moved on. And we have a set of new members who are taking the work that has been done before and working to update that work based on what's happened in the last decade in our field, some of which we've discussed today, Alex.
Oh,
Um, Now, one of the things that we're doing in order to kind of prepare ourselves for this large effort is to do a series of informational webinars where we're going through all of the professional standards that IBSTIPI has published, and we're discussing those with the community in order to increase awareness of IBSTIPI, as well as to solicit input from folks who are perhaps interested in this area. I actually just gave. I want to say it was on. It was earlier this week or late last week. I forget. Days are blurring together. It's the end of the semester at the University of Florida, and things just kind of get very fast. But what I can say is I'll be giving a webinar on the design and development competencies on April 20th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And I'll provide you with the details of that. It's a free webinar. Anyone is free to join and sign up, where we're going to be going over the instructional design competencies related to design and development that were developed and presented in 2012. And we'll be soliciting input from those who attend the webinar to inform our next steps in terms of developing this next slate of standards. So I'd be very interested if folks from your listenership would want to join.
Oh, great. Yeah. And I'll make sure that I'll promote that to the 20 some thousand followers that, you know, keep me going here. And
Couple, one or two.
on LinkedIn. Yeah, well, it's been the work of a decade. So it's not like, not going to brag here. Like, oh, yeah, you started 6 months ago. So I really, thank you so much, man. This has been really insightful. It opens up many different ways of thinking. It certainly has changed quite a bit the way I look at LXD because I always had that question as to what angle should we look at, should we look at this from? And I'll be glad to promote the webinar and also promote what's going on with its TP. But I'm assuming that based on our revisions, its TP may change to its TPX.
I don't know about that.
Okay, well, it's room, right? So, Matt, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming into Style Origins, folks. For your all of you listening, God bless you, regardless of your spiritual beliefs. Please be safe, peace with everything you do, and we'll see you or you'll hear us on the next episode.
Thanks so much, Alex.